So my presentation is about smart content, and before I get into all that, what makes it smart, I want to give you a little bit of background about myself. So I'm the Chief Content Strategist for MarkLogic, which means that I'm responsible for the content strategy on both the front end, what people will see, consumers would consume, and how producers produce. So I'm looking at both the systems that we're using internally as well as what is the messaging that we're going to go out with. And in a prior life, before turning over into technology companies, I was the digital executive for New Jersey Press, which was later bought by Gannett. So there I was responsible for platforming 6 papers and worrying about repurposing and engagement and monetization. Obviously, we didn't have the technology then that we do now, and that was really a shame. So anyways, who are you guys? How many here are folks that are in media? You raise your hand? Okay, good. And entertainment specifically? It's like you're here and you're there. Okay, and how about nonprofits? Libraries, museums? Okay, good amount of you. Anybody on the commercial side? Commercial enterprises, not media entertainment? 1, 2, 3, okay. Anybody not have enough coffee to figure out where you're supposed to be, which category? Okay, terrific. So smart content. This guy, I have nothing up there. What did I do wrong? Let me just advance it. So Herbert Simon was a noted economist. Economists always seem to have these great sayings, don't they? Back in 1971, he said, "A wealth of information creates a poverty of attention." And if you see my inbox, you totally get it, right? It's like 500 pieces of email every single day, and I just go ignore, ignore, ignore. And what do we all do? We look for ways to discard the message, to disqualify the message. Simon would say that we're bombarded with so many of these messages that that's the only way to really to thrive. So relevancy, therefore, is crucial if you're going to stand a fighting chance. So what is this idea of smart content? I'm assuming you've all heard it, right? Smart content? Show of hands. Anybody having any idea what it really means? Okay. I love it when people shake their head no. So smart content is this idea, it's like Match.com. We want to match people with the right content. And it's usually about unstructured information. So it could be video, it could be text, it could be anything. And normally there's 2 tenets. You want it to be findable and you want it to be reusable. But what I want to show is that it really breaks down even further. We can start looking at it in terms of from findability, which is great. That's if you know what to look for. But how discoverable is it? Can that content find you? That serendipitous, wow. Relevant, has to be relevant, we get that. But if it's relevant, and I really like it a lot, I may want to use it in my own collection. So can I copy it? Or are the words embedded in an image and therefore not going to go rekey the whole thing in? That's not very useful. Reusable. Reusable is a little bit of a nuance to that, and probably is more of a back-end idea that you can now create a new version from it. So not only just putting it in the collection, but actually being able to reversion it. So smart content impacts, as I was saying before, the front-end users, because it makes it very engaging, and also the back-end users, you guys, because it helps you either save money or make money. Now, when we talk about smart content, there are so many different degrees, okay? Just like, we got this cute little toddler here, and they do something adorable, and everybody goes, oh, isn't it so brilliant? The baby's so brilliant, right? But we can agree that the brilliance of a 2-year-old is a far cry different from the brilliance of a postdoc, right? So, and what's the big distinction here is that it's about discipline. It's about discipline and the amount of work and resources you're going to put into it. So when companies talk about smart content, they address the they get my gender right. I mean, nothing makes me disqualify a message faster than calling me Mr. Burley, okay? Nope, gone. Okay, now you get it right, okay, yay. And if I'm living in Paris, you present it to me in French, okay, that's sort of smart, that's nice. But that's not really what we're talking about. It's just a good start. So what is smart, as Chris was alluding to before, is when the SNL app shows me, in sequence, the sketches I want to see by learning my likes and dislikes. And with over 300 hours of content, and I was one of those Saturday Night Live fans that watched it a lot in the 80s and then petered off, other parts of my life, having kids, and nobody stayed up until 11 o'clock anymore, 11:30, because I was in bed when the kids were in bed. So how they wanted to take this 300 hours of rich content and present it to their audiences. And one of the ways that they did it with as I said, this smart content. I'm going to get into the specifics in a little bit. But honestly, if you're a binger, and Chris, it sounds like you binge watched, I mean, it is a great time sink because they really did do a super job of figuring out what people would want to see next. Another example is the BBC Olympics. This actually started with the BBC World Cup. The BBC is a public agency, and they have a mandate. They must create an engaging product. Okay, it's moving without me. I guess I must have I borrowed some slides from a colleague of mine, and he loves builds, so I think there's a little, so if it disappears again, yell. The BBC wanted to make its Olympics more personable, more interactive. They knew social media was going to be huge. And they also knew that with 10,000 athletes, 200 companies, it was going to be near impossible for the dozen or so journalists to be able to create all those static pages. So what they wanted the journalists to do is do what journalists do best: write content, deep analysis, and so on. And a lot of other parts and pieces that you see up there were actually served up dynamically. And they did that through metadata. So there were so many different options for people. It was the most watched Olympics ever. They had live stat overlays. They had Twitter feeds that people could choose. And they were doing all of this because of smart content. So this idea of smart content, it starts with the metadata. It starts with the enhancing or enriching of the content. And when I say metadata, let me make a distinction. I'm talking about descriptive metadata primarily. We have a lot of administrative metadata. We have time code. It's great. We have the date something happened. We have the camera it came from, perhaps, the system that generated. But that doesn't really tell me what it's about. And what I've discovered in the years of publishing and digital publishing and even having my own publishing business before moving to MarkLogic is that people are really good with 3 to 5 tags, 3 to 5 descriptors about what something is. After that, they're gone. Bored, done with, on to the next project. So if I'm going to create something, and well, the other problem with metadata is that for descriptive metadata is we're typically doing it working with the finished good, right? A lot of you are archivists. So at that point, you're over there and you're summing up. You're summing up and you're saying, this is about going to Alaska. So there was an Alaska trip, and you might say it was black and white, and you're going to remember what else did I see in that image that might stand out, and you might be able to pull out 1 or 2 more things. But for the most part, when you're talking about a finished good, the amount of metadata that you're going to be able to put in is going to be not as robust. That's if you're using humans, especially with tagging. Now, if you start working with a little more structure around it, where you're giving that human, all right, pick a category. Let's start with looking for things. I'm telling you to look for the following, and you're filling it in accordingly. And of course, you get in a habit, right? Because you know these by like the back of your hand after a while. You can now, maybe you've upped it to 5 to 7 descriptors. If you're working with machines, the machines can then load in thesauri and dictionaries and be able to augment and say, okay, this metadata is not just about Barack Obama, but President of the United States. So you now can add more description with the assistance of a machine. That's great. The third step is where the machine, usually a different machine, the computational machine, can start recognizing the metadata and traversing the metadata to find the asset or the asset element you're looking for. So, I know I'm giving a lot of information here. Let's go back to Saturday Night Live. So at Saturday Night Live, we know they started this project, I think it was February of a year ago, right before the 40th anniversary. And they got this idea, let's have an app, and let's have an app with these 300 hours, these 40 years collection. And by the way, this collection had been for free out there on the NBC site for all these years, 10 years, 15 years, whatever. And no one really consumed it. No one really consumed it. It was like, people go and they play and disappear. It wasn't really relevant. It wasn't, if you were very interested in something from the 1970s and the 1980s, why would you go and look at it from this time frame? And maybe the images that were up there had no relevance to your lifestyle or who you were. So they said, all right, let's sit down and let's create a taxonomy. And they worked with the writers of the different sketches, and they did this very quickly. They did not boil the ocean. They decided right off the bat they were going to look at who's in the sketch. Are there performers? By the way, is it a performer or is it an actor? Performer could be a musician, an actor is an actor. A person like Barack Obama is actually on the show. Is he really a... So they had to come up with a common vocabulary across the board. How are we going to refer to this? And they started looking at the different metadata, and of course product and title was important because of era, people looking at it from that perspective. And if you think about it, all this metadata was being stored in all these different databases, right? So you'd have the asset over here, and then you'd have over here a list of what appeared in what decade, and over here something else, so on and so forth. And what they found is that they needed a way to be very flexible with some of the attributes of some of the characters. And when you start thinking about it, and let me flip to the next screen and it'll make a lot more sense. So Denise Maharel is the tiny hands person, not to be confused with Donald Trump, but the world of Denise Maharel. Now, we knew that this person has this category of this characteristic of having these tiny hands. Now, is that really a category you're going to put in an Excel spreadsheet? And this is the next problem with metadata. It's typically we've stored it in a very structured format, in an Excel spreadsheet, in a SQL database. There has to be another way of actually describing this information so it's findable again. And what we have been encouraging people to do, and it's not just us, I'm sure a lot of library scientists in the room have been looking at ontologies and looking at semantics. But the next step is taking semantics and putting it on the front end and letting the machine do the work for you. So here we've got this idea that we've got, we're using ontologies then instead of categories. And what's fascinating about it is you can actually have a document. We make everything a document when it comes into MarkLogic. But you have the document, and then you can reach out and be able to add on these different characteristics. In a typical SQL database or an Excel database, an Excel spreadsheet, that criteria would be so sparse that you discard it. But if you think about it, it's that sparse data that actually has the attributes that you're really normally looking for. It's that rarity, right? So you don't want to just put it on the cutting room floor. You want to make sure you're capturing it. And using ontologies and semantics is a great way to do that. I'll just move a little bit faster here. So the world of Barack Obama, they had an issue with, Barack Obama as a character. It's actually as a person. There were different people that impersonated, and they even had a character called the Rock Obama. Again, that wouldn't have fit very well in an Excel spreadsheet or in a SQL database, and that became yet another issue. So when you take metadata and you mix it with semantics, you're now adding this component of smart content. This is the beginning of smart content. The other thing about semantics, and I'll show you in a little bit, is also known as triples. And these triples, because it's a subject, predicate, and an object, it's the association between two things. There's actually a fourth component, and that's a unique URI back to the asset. So if we can harness that, that's when you start with dynamic publishing. So back to Saturday Night Live, and in 2-3 short months, and that includes getting the team together to figure out what is this ontology. Let's agree on the language that we're going to refer. Is it a performer? Is it an impersonator? What are we going to talk about? How are we going to characterize it? And let's sit down and do it quickly. And they did. And they programmed it and released it. And the app it soared to the top. It was the #1 app in the iTunes App Store. If you haven't done it, I'd wait for you to go on vacation because it is a time sink and you don't want to lose your day job. It's very easy to get addicted, and it's a little Tinderish. You swipe and you say I like, I don't like, and the machine learns that. You don't have to give your personal information, but if you do, what you get is now that personalized presentation. Okay, Diane, you didn't like this, but you do like that character, so we're going to predict you're going to like this pathway. And it's really semantics that ties together all of this. I'm going to switch gears here. I'm going to go out of the entertainment world into something sort of boring, which is my world. This is our asset. We're now in the process of trying to build an asset library so that we can quickly assemble new marketing components. I mean, typically what happens is we would do a white paper, and somebody says, oh, I want an image that does da-da-da-da, and you're over there hunting for the image, you can't find the image. I'm seeing a lot of people nodding. Apparently this is not just my pain. So what do is we recreate. Oh, and then when we recreate it, doesn't it look slightly better than the original version? So now we got two versions of something that were very similar. Which one should we really go with? So that's not good from a branding standpoint. You want a uniformity, and you also don't want to constantly be reinventing the wheel from a cost standpoint. So what we're trying to do, again, instead of just doing metadata on the finished product, which what I'm going to show you is really on the finished good, we set up our list of what our assets are. We've got our catalog of the physical assets, the categories of it. And then on the next screen here, I'm showing you the actual assets themselves. And then we turn this into now using the ontology that we've created, and we're using a free open source tool called Protege. We now have OWL, and we load the OWL from Protege directly into MarkLogic, and this is the code that comes out. This is the first step for us to be creating a dynamic learning path. Someone comes to our site, and they're going down a path. I'm not saying it's going to be as exciting as the SNL app, but I do think it's going to be very relevant to people when they're learning about a new product to be able to follow this path. What I'd like to do, and this is the aspirational portion of the show, is make it so that when I'm producing content on the back end, why can't my producers have an interface that says, if you're looking at this image, maybe you might want to select one of these in your finished good. We're not quite there yet. Hopefully, maybe next year you'll invite me back and I'll be able to tell you we are there. So what we find is that throughout the course of producing anything, we're always in a situation, whether it's inception through pre-production, production, doesn't matter what industry, this happens to be a movie example, but you end up creating metadata for each one of those, right? You've got an idea. That idea might be in a Word document. The Word's going to have a whole bunch of administrative metadata around it. Who's the author? We have that information. What's this about? We've got a little bit of metadata extraction there. And what are we doing? We're always putting these in individual databases, never cross-pollinating. I mean, that's what this group is all about, cross-pollinating within the industry. But this is the problem. We don't cross-pollinate within the silos of our own organization or the silos of the entire workflow chain. And then you end up with this spaghetti. Well, I think it's over there, and over in Hollywood, they literally have golf carts where they're driving to different parts of the studio to find out, can I use your metadata library to see if I can find what I'm looking for over there. And then, of course, you need to know the permissions, and you need to have a good relationship with those people that are like standing there at the door with the alligators and whatever to keep you out. So if you're really going to be productive at this, you really need a much more seamless way of doing it. And so this just is not smart. So what if you could bring the metadata up to the beginning of the workflow process at the inception? So we were invited to be part of the ETC, Electronic Technology Center initiative. It's called the Suitcase Project. These are the companies that were involved. There's 5 different components of it. What I'm going to describe are 4 different components of it. What I'm going to describe is the metadata portion of it. Disney is a client of ours. They are very happy with what we're doing with them, and they were really a strong proponent of saying MarkLogic has to be the database behind this initiative. So the Suitcase is a short film produced by Abby Corbin, and what they wanted to do is, as they were shooting the movie, start capturing metadata along the way. As I said, typically you're doing it at the finished goods portion, and you're missing so much. But think about it from a monetization standpoint. You've got a Coke can on a table, and it's in English, but you want to sell into the Asian market, and that Coke can in post could be introduced in the language, in an Asian language. You've got a billboard that's on the side but prominent enough, and it's touting a hotel in the United States, but this is going to play in France, so why couldn't it be a hotel? They could sell these product placements, but you can't sell what you don't know and what you can't find. So is there a better way? And I have extra slides in here because I think this deck is available to you later, and you might want to actually be reading through some of the details of it. So I'm going to go quickly through this. The idea was the metadata would be descriptive, and they wanted to have a very described, structured way of pulling out that descriptive metadata. Who are the characters? What's the location? What's the core activity going on in the scene? Is there any on-screen action? Is there whatever? And remember, too, I mean, you guys all know this. I'm preaching to the choir here. Most of this is assembled after the fact, so you've got all these individual scenes, right? And then you're going to assemble it later on. That takes time, that assembly process. And then you've got the monetization issue on top of it. So you're looking at from 2 different perspectives. And the third perspective is the finished good. If indeed you can do this localization where you're now changing props and so on into the localized nature, you're making it more relevant and enjoyable for the moviegoer as well. So they did use an ontology. The information is presented as triples. Has anybody ever heard of a triple before? Is that common? Okay, it's not a little bit. I'll get into it. Joe Franick is the subject, and so what is his relationship to this object? He plays the character, right? So the character is Mojin Arya. I'm sorry, it's the other way around. The character, Joe Franick, is played by Mojin Arya. So we know that Mojin is an actor, and we know that this is the character, and you can keep those things separate. His dialogues, and you can see this is the type of information that you can now traverse when you have triples. It's very clear. You never have an entity out of context with very little effort, and certainly almost no machine effort, computational effort. You're able to quickly find the information you're looking for. So they went through this process of pulling together all this information. They made a list of what was high priority versus lower priority. I don't know if I necessarily agree with this list, but they didn't ask me. The high priority obviously is the characters in the scenes, what were the events and actions, etc. Lower priority, and to me this is the monetization part of it, right? If we know that this is a prop or an object and you can replace it, or wardrobe, the dress, who made the dress, and is the dress something that if you wanted to monetize it and be able to say, because the second screen, this dress is now available at such and such a place, and that's money. So that's why I don't necessarily agree with that lower priority thing. But anyway, so they ended up pulling all of this information in. So what they did is they started off by putting the script in MarkLogic, and then as a scene was being shot, the people that were working on that scene would literally be able to push a button to stop the replay, and they would be able to put in the metadata from a pull-down menu. So there was structure behind it. There was ability to do some overrides and put in some looser descriptions, but all of this was then put inside. Now the Suitcase is supposed to be released, I think, at the end of this month. We are doing a paper. Nancy Silver, who's a colleague of Scott's and mine, will be writing a white paper talking about, were they able to actually assemble the film faster? How did it impact the post process? Were they able to, what are some of the other examples of things? Some of what they learned is that they got rid of some of the administrative data right off the bat. It just made it more cluttered and a little bit more difficult to maneuver. So it will be best cases, best practices, and what the results are. So that paper will come out in the fall, and I know that she's hoping to present it in Pittsburgh to you guys, so that would be terrific. So if you're going to go and get involved with this, I think it's really important that you realize you cannot do this by yourself. But I also want to tell you that I think this is career making. We're at a time in history, technological history, where you have so much information. You have to figure out how to winnow it quickly and present the most relevant to an audience that's exceedingly overburdened with messages. You're going to need cross-functional teams within your organization, people that might be very good at coming up with ways to describe things, people who have a vision, people who are coders. You're going to need these cross-functional teams. But I can assure you that if you invest in this yourself personally, whether it's for your current organization or your next one, this will be a career skill you will take with you for the next, I can see this for the next 10, 15 years easily. You want to embrace your industry standards. XML is a standard. Sparkle, which is a triple format, is a standard. When you're working with these things, work with the standards. It makes life much easier. It working with developers much easier. Start thinking in terms of a common language internally. Is it a performer? Is it an actor? Is it an impersonator? How are you going to describe it? Again, when internally in my group, we have, the sales guys are looking for something and they call something one thing, and the engineers call the same image something else. We have to have that common language. So I'm also going to say, don't boil the ocean. Keep it small. The Saturday Night Live opportunity was very small. They did not worry about every single asset that NBC produces. They did one thing, and they just burrowed in and got it done. Learn the power of semantic data modeling, and I would really, this is a key buzzword for engineers and developers. They love cool. This is cool. So takeaways for you guys. Learn these technologies. This is a triple. Chevy is a performer, is in SNL. Okay, that just makes up a triple. Very simple. You have lots and lots of triples, and when you run a query, like the BBC does, it said, they created a sports ontology. The Olympics has a series of events, and an event has an actual winner. So the query, and these are all of the athletes that perform in that event. So the query that's on the front end, serving up the information, says, give me the winner of this event that occurred on that date, and that name appears on the page. It wasn't a what do you call it, a person having to create a static HTML page. The machine did this. Relationships are obvious because you can do inference, so now we don't even need to know that Chevy, we know he's in SNL because he's a performer that's on SNL. So I'm with MarkLogic. As Chris said, it's just not real sexy to talk about MarkLogic because we are a database that handles all these different data models, including semantics. We handle structured and unstructured information. We are a great alternative if you've been struggling with how do I model all of this information, if you need something that's very robust, if you need zero data loss and zero latency for searching. We are powering just about everything that from healthcare.gov to SNL to Library of Congress, tons of stuff. And as I said, we do have this white paper that's coming out. If you guys are interested in getting it, just send me an email. Put the Suitcase Project in the subject line, and I'll be more than happy to get it out to you as soon as Nancy's done with it. So do you have any questions? I know we don't have a lot of time, but perhaps.
I'll say quickly that there was the typo in the program. The next speaker starts at 10:15.
Sorry?
The next speaker starts at 10:15, so we do have plenty of time.
Oh, okay.
Hi, my name is Nick Gold with Chesapeake Systems. So you got into this towards the end of the presentation. What is an ontology, right? You're not just adding a theory of information to a set of technologies. It's obviously, you got into this, it's a Sparkle database, basically, right?
Right.
So I guess my question is, one of the reasons we're a systems integrator of MAM and workflow automation solutions, and one of the main reasons we always tell our clients, stay away from generic keywords, is that semantic relationship that's sort of implicit in a key value metadata pair obviously doesn't exist if you're just throwing a bunch of random keywords into a keyword field, right? So let's say you have a database, you've already got a DAM, a MAM, a PAM, whatever it is, and you have structured your taxonomy in terms of the more key value metadata pair type. And so there's at least sort of implicit ontological relationships between the keys and the metadata values that you have associated with them. Can you layer in an ontology database, even maybe from a totally different vendor than your MAM or PAM or DAM database, and kind of establish as a separate ontology database what those key value relationships are, even if it's not a holistic solution from one vendor?
Yes, and that's an amazingly great question. One of the things I say internally is be meaningful, specific. I can't stand that generic stuff. You're not finding anything, right? Men, okay, great. That's all of you, so half of you anyway. But how do we find you? We need a meaningful, specific attribute to find you. And that's the same thing with key values. It has to be unique. Less so in this industry, the industry of finding information for information publishing, information reuse, but in healthcare and in pharma, life sciences, financial services, we're finding ontology. So what is an ontology? An ontology is a common language. The common language could be within your group, your department. You call this the clicker. If you're the engineer, you don't call it the clicker. They probably have some great name that's this long that would scare the hell out of the rest of us, right? So, but the common language is we need to know that when they say this whatchamacallit and the clicker are the exact same thing. So that's this idea of creating a common language. So your department may have a language and use your own ontology. Your organization, especially when you're talking about a very large organization that's has lots of different properties and cross-functional purposes, will have its own ontology, but the industry may have its own ontology. You have unique identifiers now for assets. There's a push right now and I can't remember the term for the motion picture industry, but there's a term that every asset should have a blankety-blank code. So they've got an ontology that they're working with. Yes, we can bring all of that in because, again, we don't care. That's all sparse data. You don't have to normalize that on the front end. What you need to do is just then start looking at the relationships between them. Oh, this means that. So yeah, that's a great question, and a lot of people, a lot smarter than me, are doing a lot with that.
Hi, Diane. Thank you very much for your presentation. Rob Cardilano from Columbia. Could you speak a little bit to the challenge of building an ontology that might have to cross multiple disciplines or multiple areas, and kind of the size of the data set, and maybe the balancing act that you might have to strive to deliver functionality like we saw with the SNL app?
Yeah, I would hope that most organizations don't act like Congress, and that they probably could come to some level of compromise. But I think that you're bringing up a really good point. It is a huge challenge. We go through, and I think what happens is you put a stake in the ground. I'm going to speak from my own internal personal experience. When we have 90,000 assets that we're dealing with at our little company. Okay. We have 90,000 assets. Some of it is educational training, it's documentation, it's the marketing stuff, video, I mean, you name it, but 90,000. So, and we have so many different content creators. The engineering team, they do things one way, and they're creating stuff in OmniGraffle, and we end up with some type of, you're nodding, oh, thank God, you know my pain. So we bring that in, and then we have to convert it into something that actually can be, human readable. So we're doing all of these things, but I think by just putting a stake in the ground, we did a book recently. We're issuing it in an EPUB, and I think those cross-functional teams were able to see, hey, if I have this image and I call it this, I can repurpose it. We can use this on the web. So normally these are teams that would stand off, but by putting them together, we found that we had a little bit more of a marriage. And that's why I encourage this cross-functional pollination. I think you're going to need to do that. But I think if you start small, we want to do a book. Maybe we want to do 10 books. Maybe we want 10 books that are also going to be 100 white papers. Maybe 100 white papers is going to be something else. And you sort of show what it could be. Then we get executive buy-in, right? Because I need resources. And we get philosophical buy-in from the folks that are on the front line trying to do it. Because the guy who wrote the book has to find these images, or he has to create them from scratch. So if now he can dip into that wider pool, and his book is going to be made better, I'm giving you the politics side of it. It's more politics than it is technology. Thank you. Any other questions?
Speaking of ontologies, is there anyone who's doing work to make the relationships between these local ontologies that you're doing and the, well-known, maybe standardized ones like DBpedia or schema.org or something like that? Because that's supposed to be the power of the web, the semantic web is, all these associations with other ontologies.
What's interesting is the BBC published its ontology. So it has a sports ontology, it has a news ontology. I know the New York Times and AP has a joint venture. They're publishing ontologies. What I find is that organizations, we've got some customers that are, and a lot of companies are just in the beginning exploratory phase of this. They know the promise, but getting there is, you're going across all these balkanized departments, and then trying to push a brand new technology into an IT group that's already overburdened with 10,000 technology products, right? But what they're doing is they're cribbing from, they start with the generic, the general, what came out in the industry, and they're now working to customize it. So if you think about this Saturday Night Live ontology, it was fairly simple, but then they had something called attributes, and then that's when you got into the Tiny Hands character. So you can keep adding onto it and sort of interpret it your own way, and republish and relearn. What I learned when I was working with one of our life sciences companies is that there are biological ontologists. I mean, it's just like amazing to me. I didn't know this, so finding it fascinating how deep you can go within a given sector and pull this information out.
Hi, good morning. Dave Miller with EMAM. A quick question. So SNL, I know long back when they were looking at their library and doing next things with it, was looking at using user-generated blog sites and other information. So did you go, I know you said you went to the producers, but did you also look at using some of the mass of public blog sites and fan sites?
I don't know that they did use that. Do you know, Scott, if they used any fan sites? I know.
They did a short-term app where they actually used some of their own internal people to do all their tagging. So they augmented it internally with people they knew on the ground to create tags. It was a pretty short window to do the project.
What was interesting, the Saturday Night Live app, is that I was talking to Eddie Lee about he's the vice president of technology of this group, and I asked him about the algorithm in creating this predictive engine. And he says, the thing is, you need an algorithm when you don't have data. He said, we have data. We know you like this and this and this and this and don't like that and that and that and that. So we're just following. So it really was interesting that the effort in modeling was reduced tremendously because you do have all this data now.
Hi, Diane, thanks. Good presentation. Ron Meglio from Viacom. Can you speak to a little bit about the concept of pushing the metadata descriptive process upstream into the production process, and kind of the successes and pushback from the content creators in describing their content upstream as opposed to downstream?
I think you're asking what's the advantages to doing it upstream or pushing it from downstream back up?
Just more your successes in doing that.
This project, and I think the idea behind it was you lose the intent of the director, of the script writer, when you're doing descriptive metadata downstream. That the closer you can do it at the time of the creation of that asset, you have a better idea, and you can sort of stay on track versus, that morphing that goes along when you're all the way downstream and you've already cut out sequences that maybe should be there. I mean, you know that industry better than I do. I do know that motion picture industry is far more robust in creating descriptive metadata than typically television shows, just because of the sheer volume of television shows, and the fact that it's just done so fast. Whereas motion pictures, there's a lot of time, and there's the opportunity to do descriptive metadata. But what I've been told by the folks that are doing this project is that when it's done downstream, it's not anywhere near as robust as when it's done at the onset. I don't know if that answers your question, but I can definitely put you in touch with people that can give you a better answer if you would like more granularity. I know Nancy Silver, my colleague, could probably dig into it with you far greater. She comes out of that industry. I don't. I come out of papers. Ooh.
Thank you.
There's a person behind.
Hi, Dirk Van Dahl from MLBAM. I wanted to go from 50,000 feet just down to 10 feet. Can you walk through the steps that might happen if I type in tiny hands and Christian Schall, let's say? So I've misidentified the performer, and I've put the words tiny hands. You mentioned that there's some weighting, important characteristic, less important characteristic, or there's some performance. Can you just talk about the weighting, the disambiguation that sort of goes to produce the result that you're offering?
Well, now you're talking the sexiness of MarkLogic. It's hard to find those moments, but I have a moment. Thank you. So MarkLogic is a database, and just a quick backstory. We actually came about after 9/11. The federal government had a big problem with all this unstructured information, and they had data coming out of Sabre and so on, and everybody said, all this intel was out there, what the heck was wrong with you? Problem was, they couldn't marry it together. They couldn't see it. And Chris went back and created a database. As he said, he was a search guy. He is a search guy. He said, I wanted to create a database that enabled search. So one of the things in this is that there's a type ahead. So as you're starting to type Kristen, it's not filling in, right? So if you started with a C, you could switch it to a K, and then quickly you find it. On the weighting side of it, you can easily, with any asset, with any attribute, you'd be able to say, give this more importance, give this less importance. I do that internally with our system that's on MarkLogic, our asset repository. All these Gartner reports were coming to the top of the repository, and I couldn't figure out, so I can do a weighting. If it says MarkLogic, I want it, weighted yay. Well, that didn't help. The Gartner stuff was still at the top, and I'm going, what the heck is wrong? I got the search people there, and what we realized is Gartner has an identifier in the footer that this is the property of Gartner given to MarkLogic. It's on every single page. So when I weighted it for MarkLogic, it now threw it to the roof. So we were able, now once we knew that that existed, we were able to exclude it and get the proper results that we were looking for. So yeah, there's a lot of games you can play with that to fine-tune it. Any other questions?
Hi, Kara Van Malsen from AV Preserve. I wanted to follow up on the 2 questions ago question. I think what the question was, and what my question is how do you incentivize folks upstream in the production process to actually apply metadata as they're doing what they're doing? And this is a concept that's been kind of, people have been trying to do this since the dawn of time or the beginning of digital production, whichever came first. And I think that you've built some strengths around making it easier for them, the drop downs, as you mentioned, and kind of things like that. But actually, how do you incentivize them to do it? And has that been successful?
That's a great question. I was actually thinking about this for a different reason this morning. And, usage becomes important, right? If something is described properly, it's going to be used more than something else. Have contests. I mean, maybe you do it as simple as that. I think that as people get used to it, first of all, it can't be optional. This is their job. They have to do it because the stakes are so high, whether it's creating something that it's a dynamic path for people or dynamic delivery or monetization after the fact. I need to know that billboard is in that scene. If I have an opportunity, a branding, lipstick manufacturer wants to have that kiss between 2 actors on a given, I've got to find it. And we've got to know where it was, and nobody wants to spend hours and hours and hours perusing. They want to be able to find it to the time code. And I think that you're going to have these success stories. You highlight these success stories. It might be a little fiction in the beginning. And aspirational, like my situation at work when I'm constantly going in there saying please. But I think at the end of the day, they're going to start realizing the benefit. But and the other thing is you can easily see usage, or you can see the amount of, are the descriptors paying off? And that's a case where usage stats would give you that information. Do we have time for one more, or we? We cannot be late of the first speaker, so thank you so much.